When you play the Game of Thrones, you
subscribe and like,
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube and welcome back to the Grease Comics YouTube channel. In today's video, we are going to be talking about A Feast for Crows, doing a book review on it as a whole. I'm pretty excited to get into this one because I actually just got done reading this book about a month ago at this point. A lot of the other books that we've been doing in the series I'd already read in months past, so they're a little fuzzy, but this one's still pretty fresh in my mind, and I have a lot to talk about in this video because when you look at it, I think if I did a poll, and I might do one this week as this video is coming out, asking you guys what your least favorite Song of Ice and Fire book is, I think this would probably be the one people point to. Now, I think there's a couple reasons for that, and I'm going to talk about it in this kind of review. I'm going to talk about the things that this book does really well, the highs of this book, as well as the lows. Now, I do think this book gets a bad rap. I think this is a very good book. I think it explores a lot of kind of plots that we have never really seen much, and we get a lot more into the culture and scope of the world in this book. But before we get into the video, if you guys like to like, subscribe, and comment, please do. It helps you on growing reach your people that might like this content as well. And let's get into the video. So I did want to say, in these longer videos, these podcast style videos, I don't know how much images and videos I'm going to be putting in as, you know, kind of content for you guys to watch while I'm talking, just because I don't have the most amount of time to be able to do that, and these are 40-minute videos usually, or at least 30-minute videos. But yeah, so I know I have been getting your guys' feedback on doing more of that type of stuff in the videos, and I've definitely been trying to implement that into the shorter videos, the videos that are not like longer than 20 minutes, because it's very time consuming to keep track of all of these sources and making sure all the images come in correctly and stuff like that. But yeah, so getting into Feast for Crows. Now, I want to talk about who of our main characters are in this book compared to how it's been for the first three books, because a lot of the themes and the main focal points of the books change with not only this book, but also A Dance with Dragons. And I'm probably going to be kind of referencing that book a lot because Feast and Dance share a lot of the same characteristics, a lot of the same themes, and I think that's going to be a big part of the video, whereas a lot of the other videos in the first three, I've talked a lot about where characters go and their arcs and how a lot of those are really good. And this video I'm probably going to focus on more of the major scale and the different type of writing that George decides to do, and how we're not kind of narrowly focused on about 3 or 4 plots, whereas we go to a lot of different other places. So talking about who our main characters are in this book, right? Our main 3 characters are Cersei. She has 10 chapters in this book. She has I believe like a 20% of this book is just Cersei alone. And then you factor in Brienne and Jaime. So those are our main 3 characters. Now, if you look at past books, right, Jaime is a fairly new POV character when you look at him only being introduced in Storm. And then Cersei, this is her first time being a POV character. So George kind of takes a big leap, putting in Cersei as the main POV for this book, when she really had never been for any other book. So that's kind of a big leap George decides to take here, and I think it really worked really well. It helps us understand Cersei a lot better, and kind of the struggles of ruling, as we'll talk about a lot in this video, and especially in next week's video as well, with Dance. But those 3 are kind of our main focal points of this book. Whereas in other books, we had, you know, Ned, we had Catelyn, we had Arya, Sansa, Tyrion, Daenerys. Those were kind of our main characters. This book doesn't have any of those. Brienne is introduced as a POV in this book as well. So we have a lot of different POV characters being introduced. Now, this book and the next book, Dances, they are very different in the way they're kind of told. As the first 3 books were kind of focused on building up to war in book 1 and the mysteries of leading up to that. And then book 2 and book 3 are the war, the kind of conclusion of the war. And now book 4 is kind of peacetime, right? There's not really much going on in the terms of war. There's a little bit of a rebellion in the Riverlands, as we'll kind of find out with Jaime. And there's a little bit of unrest, right? Because we don't know what's going on in the Vale. We don't really know, you know, all that stuff. The North still has Stannis in it. There's a little bit of unrest, a little bit of rebellions, but nothing that would seem to kind of threaten the Lannister-Tyrell alliance. These could all easily be crushed. They have overwhelming like forces and supplies against all these enemies, but again, still very dangerous threats if left unprovoked. And that's something that I think is interesting, is that we're entering peacetime, right? If everything goes as planned and all this goes well, this should be peacetime. And what this book and the next book really focus on is how poor ruling and bad decisions kind of lead to more conflict. Because what I will always say, and something that I don't think a lot of people bring attention to, is book 1 and book 4 and 5 have a lot of similarities, right? Where book 1, we're kind of leading into a war. It's about building tension. We see a lot of bad mistakes. Robert Baratheon making really bad mistakes. Ned making mistakes, leading to this conflict that is the War of the Five Kings. And we see that here again, but with just different people. And we also, the big thing here is George doesn't have to spend as much time building the world from kind of the ground up. Now, he does do a lot of world building in these last 2 books because we do go to a lot of different places, which we'll talk about with Dorne and the Iron Islands kind of being the main 2 that are introduced into the story, as we've never actually gone there really. We've gone through with we had gone there with Theon briefly. We learn about their culture a little bit through Theon, but then we definitely get an expansion on that with Victarion and Asha as well, or Yara for the show watchers. But this book really shows you the struggles of peacetime ruling. And it's something that I think gets overlooked, and it's also a major theme of kind of the last couple books, is that the crown is very heavy. It is something that is very difficult to do, to be a very good ruler, to be just, to be playing the game correctly, managing political things going on, because as we see through Cersei, right? Cersei's a character where she understands that the Tyrells are trying to gain power in King's Landing. She's not mistaken when she thinks that. But the way that she goes about kind of thwarting them is really bad, right? She constantly is publicly kind of shaming or, you know, doing stuff to the Tyrells that's just stupid to anger them, where she's not really subtly limiting their power while also keeping them in alliance. Something we see that Kevin Lannister does very good in the last chapter we actually really get from George, that's kind of confirmed, right, in Dance with his POV chapter in that book. We'll talk about that a little bit later on in you know, Dance when we do that review. But we see how Cersei is not great at that. And that's a major theme where we see a lot of different types of ruling, right? Where when we talk about Dance, we'll talk about Daenerys and how Jon intend to rule. But if we even look at how Balon Greyjoy ruled, because this is a big problem when it comes to who the Greyjoys are going to crown in this, or not the Greyjoys, but the Ironborn are going to crown in this book, right? Because you have so many different styles of ruling, right? And where you see as Balon Greyjoy's idea of ruling and how he went about things were not very smart. He weakened the Ironborn or the Iron Islands power a decent amount repeatedly. He had failed for a failed rebellion. His plan during the War of the Five Kings was really bad. I've done a bad video on that, but it shows that when you have these different characters that are trying to get the thrones, you have a Victarion, you have an Asha, you have Euron, they all 3 have different ways of going about trying to rule. And this book also shows us the difficulty of ruling as a woman. Asha is basically denied the Seastone chair just because she's a woman, even though she is like Balon's legitimate heir, something George tends to write about a lot as well. We're going to see this with House of the Dragon with Rhaenyra, and as well as Rhaenys as well. But it is something that's very interesting to note and to talk about. And then Victarion is kind of taking on a lot of the similar beats of his brother Balon. So you kind of have that ruling style. And then Euron is kind of the one where he's like, you know, we're going to go with the dragons and we're going to do all that stuff. And it's just a different style of ruling. It's very similar to the way we see Renly and Stannis, where they have 2 different ideas of who should be king and even how to rule as a whole. It's something that George really likes to parallel, and he does a great job of that in this book as well. So that's something I really wanted to bring up as well. And getting into kind of how I was talking about how Game of Thrones is very similar to these last 2 books, even kind of the overall plot makes sense when you're looking at what did Game of Thrones do. Game of Thrones was really the book that was supposed to set up the next 2 and beyond, right? It was the setup book where it had those payoffs at the end, it had really big moments, but in the end it was a world building and setup book. And I've talked about that in my first review. So again, if you have not seen the rest of the reviews I've done, all the books up to this point, I would strongly recommend watching that video before continuing on in this video. But that book really does a great job introducing us into the world, And this one parallels us really well into that. And if you think about where a lot of characters end off in Feast and in Dance, because again, both of those books are very similar to Game of Thrones because they're separated, right? George decided to separate the books because it was going to be so long. He also just thought he was going to do a 5-year gap, which he ended up not doing. But getting back to the point here, think about where all these characters end up. Right, Cersei and the King's Landing plot ends up where there's a lot of unrest going on. The Lannister-Tyrell alliance is very fragile at best. The Tyrells have brought all their kind of armies back with Rhaenyra Tarly, trying to, get Marjorie kind of free and all that stuff. And that is very unrest. Like, there's a lot of unrest going on. And you look at where Jaime is by the end of this book with Brienne. Also, their storyline's probably going to collide, setting up Winds, which should be really an amazing chapter. Those two are going to be meeting together. And then there's going to be something going on with Lady Stoneheart. Could be a possible Red Wedding 2.0. I really hope that is. I think it would be really cool if kind of the Arya scene we get in the show is more of a Lady Stoneheart type scene. I think it'd be a really good payoff to her character. It would make sense for why George brings her back. Lady Stoneheart is another character we can talk about along with Brienne's storyline. Lady Stoneheart is kind of this character that is Catelyn, but only kind of the vengeful side of Catelyn, the spiteful side of Catelyn, and that really gets amplified, right? Where Catelyn wasn't really a vengeful type person. As we see when, Robb is getting crowned and all that, Catelyn kind of argues that we should, go back north. Right, where doing all this is not going to bring back Ned, right? We should just trade Jaime and all that and get the girls back and then go home, right? Which it kind of plays into that part of her. But when you see all of her kids die, it kind of plays into the kind of angry side we see with her with Jon. So Lady Catelyn comes back, and I think the moral of the story is going to be something that was kind of similar to the show where the Hound was the person like, hey, to Arya, don't let your vengeance and all that kind of a revenge just cloud your judgment and eat you alive as a person. It's not good for you. I think that's what Lady Stoneheart's role is going to be in the future books. But talking about her in this book specifically, we really don't see her until the end of the book. She's a big character towards the end. We hear a lot about her through Jaime and through other characters, but Brienne finally does meet her at the end of her book. And Brienne's a very interesting character because Brienne kind of takes the role of Arya in this book, where Arya was kind of the adventurous character, kind of going around the land, having interactions with kind of the small common folk. And that's what Brienne's role is in this, right? Brienne is a character that is trying to find Sansa and Arya, and it's kind of like where'd she go? Like trying to figure out where she went. Now, us, the audience, we know where, Arya and Sansa are, but Brienne doesn't. And we get about, I believe it's 7 chapters throughout the book, and Brienne's storyline, I do think, is one of the weaker ones for having the most amount of chapters within this book. But I do really like Brienne. Like I said, when I talk about these books and I try to be critical of these books, I love all 5 of these books. I don't think there is a bad A Song of Ice and Fire book for the main series. I think they're all very good. And that's why when I did, I've made a video before talking about kind of defending Feast for Crows and Dance with Dragons. I don't think there is a bad book in this series. I just think there's different styles of writing that go into this book and the next book than were in the first 3. Because these 2 are kind of dealing a lot with kind of all the big payoffs of book 3. And Brienne does a lot of kind of wandering around, kind of, again, seeing the horrors of war, and eventually, going through all these kind of adventures and her, roaming the land, trying to find, a lady with auburn hair, which is Sansa. And she gets captured, right, by, I guess, the Brotherhood Without Banners, and she's basically given the option, are you going to hang or are you going to find Jaime? And she chooses to live on, and she basically ends up meeting up with Jaime in kind of Dance and all that. We're not really going to talk about that yet in this video, but that's kind of where Brienne's storyline goes, and her being the 3rd most prominent character in this book, that really does summarize basically what happens with Brienne. Like, she just kind of gets in a couple fights, she's wandering, she's kind of an Arya character, but not is impactful. I feel like Brienne's not a very impactful character within this book. She's just kind of a fun character, I think, to kind of see her and Podrick's adventures. She's not doesn't have a big impact in the story at the moment. She's going to in the next few books. She's gonna have a very large impact, but in this book, really not a big impact. If you take her out of the story, not a whole lot changes really. But in the next books, again, and like I said, she will be very impactful. Looking at Jaime, I think this is a really great book for Jaime, where Jaime, his kind of like character arc is started in book 3, but in book 4, it's really him evolving as a person, trying to let go of kind of Cersei and letting go of all of these things that have made him a bad person, and kind of atoning for his sins in this book. Now, don't get me wrong, he still makes some bad decisions, especially earlier on in the book when he's still trying to be with Cersei and all that. But by the end of this book, Jaime is probably in the best place that he needs to be. He's, leading an army and kind of focusing on himself. This kind of almost feels like therapy for Jaime. He's getting away from everything that's always held him back in life and all of that. And he eventually, gets this letter from Cersei after River Run's been taken. Again, a great plan by Jaime to actually let Edmure go into the castle to kind of give it up himself. Really great idea, and shows how intellectually, like militarily wise, Jaime is a very smart commander, and we will see this even further into kind of the next book. But Jaime gets this letter that calling, Jaime back to King's Landing because Cersei's in trouble. She's being imprisoned by the Faith Militant, which again she armed. And Jaime's like, don't care. I just don't care. And then he just doesn't go there. So again, it's kind of the completion of Jaime's arc for me, right? At this point, Jaime is a different person. He's kind of going away from Cersei. He doesn't have those same feelings, and it's kind of the completion of a 2-book kind of arc, right? Where I don't think this is the end of Jaime's character. I think he still has more he's going to do, but I do think for his kind of character arc, this really is the kind of almost conclusion of that, where he's grown as a person. It'll be interesting to see what George does with his character. I definitely could see Jaime ended up dying with Cersei, where Jaime realizes that Jon Con and Aegon are coming to King's Landing, and Jaime tries to race back with the army. Maybe he gets there a little bit early, and he sees what Cersei's become, and maybe he ends up killing her. I can see something like that formulating. And those are our 3 main ones. Now, we have a lot of other characters that have a couple chapters here and there. Notably, Samwell. I think Samwell is probably my least favorite POV in this book, which is kind of sad because I really liked Samwell's POVs in book 3. But in this book, I'm not a fan. I mean, a lot of Samwell's chapters are very low impact to the story. The first couple are like they're just on a boat, and the big revelation is that, Jon switched the children, which, it's interesting, but it's like we kind of find that out in Jon's POV in the next book anyway. So it's like, and then, so I'm trying to remember what happens in all 5. So I know you have one chapter where it's him leaving the wall. You have another chapter where they're kind of on the boat. I think you have a 3rd chapter where they're also on the boat, I believe. And then you have one where they're in Bravos, and you have another one where they end up leaving, I believe, is the breakdown of his 5 chapters. But not really much impact. I mean, Sam meets Arya, which is cool. But again, low impact. Not really a lot going on with Sam in this book. Just kind of a little update of what's going on. Maester Aemon does die in this book, which is very sad. But I don't really got much to say about Sam. I think Sam, kind of the big arc for him has always been trying to gain confidence and all of that. So also, I don't know if it's going to come through on the video, but I have been having like alerts from my antivirus protection while I've been recording every once in a while. So I hope you guys don't hear that, but if you do, that's what that is. So sorry about that. But yeah, moving on to our next couple characters that have a couple chapters. Sansa and Arya actually have a very limited role in this book, right? They both have 3 chapters, which is their low of all of the books besides the last one where Arya only has 2 and Sansa doesn't even actually appear. But this is kind of the lowest for these 2 characters, which is interesting because when you look at the show of how they did Arya's character, Arya was a much more bigger figure in the show, whereas in the book, she's definitely limited, right? She has a couple of chapters where we kind of see her training, and she actually kills someone by the end of the book, and we see her kind of taking on this persona and trying to grow and be someone that is no one, even though we still know she's Arya because we're in her head, and she has like a lot of thoughts about, herself. But Arya just, I think, has a really good setup book. This is what this book is supposed to be for. Arya is going to be this prominent assassin-type character throughout the last 2 books, and this is just a book to build her character. So when I talk about in this book, there's just a lot of characters that are build-ups, right? We have to have those build-up characters and the build-up chapters so that those chapters can be paid off in meaningful ways in later books. Not every chapter can be this great, grand chapter. And I think Feast is plagued with being the book right after Storms, because Storm is just a book full of payoffs. It is a book of payoffs. Like, we're not even halfway, we're a little over halfway in Storms, and you're getting the Red Wedding. Like, there's nothing that comes close to that amount of significance in either one of the next 2 books. So this book was really about retooling and setting up, and that's what Arya really feels like in this book, where George is kind of setting her up and giving her chapters to develop as this assassin type role that we will later see in future books. Now, Sansa is a little different because I think as Sansa, you see a lot more of the politics going on in Westeros. We see how brilliantly Littlefinger is able to kind of take control of the Vale, and Sansa even starting to play the game is really great in this book as well. So a lot of great character growth, a lot of great moments between Sansa and Littlefinger. And I really do like Sansa in this book. Even though she has very few chapters, this is actually my favorite book for her, because she is starting to grow and not be as kind of maybe naive as she was in a few other books. But yeah, this is definitely my favorite Sansa book, even though we only get 3 chapters from her. We also get 2 chapters from Ariane Greyjoy. So, I am someone that I don't really like Ariane Greyjoy as a POV character, but the chapters he is in are pretty impactful. We learn that, Balon Greyjoy is dead in Ariane Greyjoy's chapter. We'd already gotten that with Robb in one of his camp meetings in the book before, but this is kind of where the Iron Islanders this is kind of the moment they know Balon's dead, I guess. So if you look at the timeline, this actually happens in Storm of Swords, this event or whatever. And Ariane Greyjoy just kind of, his first chapter is kind of setting the stage for what is to come in the Greyjoy plot. And it's actually a very interesting plot as well, because we're trying to see who is going to take over as the King of the Iron Islands. Now, Ariane Greyjoy also appears in another chapter, which is probably the biggest and the kind of peak of the Greyjoy plot, which is going to be the King's Moot. We also have his POV during it, which I think is a very good decision. I think giving a neutral character, or maybe not a neutral, because we know Aeron wants Victarion to win, but giving a neutral character, not one of the characters trying to be king, as your kind of POV and narrative into this is actually a really great idea by George. And we kind of figure out that all these characters kind of end up going for Euron. Well, they don't, the characters themselves, like Asha and Victarion, don't, but Euron basically ends up winning. And we see kind of the horror Ariane Greyjoy faces, because he is someone that is very religious, and this goes against everything he kind of knows, and it's not a good look, right? So Asha basically has to go back to Deepwood Mott, because basically Euron was gonna marry her to some guy she didn't want to marry, and he also could probably kill her as well, because she would be a threat to the throne. And then Victarion ends up kind of having to suck it up and just follow his brother. Yeah, so Victarion, a very bitter person, but I think Victarion is another great POV character. I love Victarion's POVs. One of the best additions, I think, of this book. We're going to talk about my favorite edition of the book in the next chapter. But we see Victarion. He is one of the best commanders of the Ironborn. He is the best one. And he is a very complex character, because he does some things that are morally very questionable, but you also see the amount of pain he's going through and the trauma he has kind of received from Euron, and also following someone like Balon, who was a very bad king in my opinion. But yeah, so only get 2 chapters from him in this book, so we don't see a ton of him, but worth bringing up. Ariane Martell is probably my favorite character that is brought into this book. I think she's really great. Another like strong female character that we see. She's someone that reminds me of kind of Marjorie Tyrell if we were to ever get a POV chapter of her, because Ariane plays the kind of princess kind of role very, very well in Dorne, and she's also one of our main POVs into Dorne, right? We see how the politics is going on. We see the Ariane Martell reveal at kind of the back end of the book. A really great chapter. I think it's one of the strongest chapters of the book. And Dorne is just such an intriguing place when you look at the politicking going on there. Something that the show really missed on, and I think it's one of the biggest reasons, this and the Greyjoy plot, I think is one of the biggest reasons that the show started to flop in season 5 and season 6, because they just basically cut these completely. And Ariane is a character I'm really looking forward to in the next book to see where she goes. I personally think she's going to get with young Griff, and who knows if she's going to die, because I don't think Aegon's going to be able to win against Daenerys. I think she'll win. I think he'll win against Cersei and the Lannisters, but I do not think he's going to beat Daenerys. But Ariane, fantastic character. We see how she kind of manipulates Eris Oakheart to kind of help her with Myrcella, and I just think a very solid character and easily my favorite addition into this book. Let me know in the comments which POV character that was brand new in this book did you like the best? Because there's a lot of them, right? There's a lot of new characters in this book, but yeah. Continuing on, we have Asha. She gets 1 POV chapter. It's a good one. I mean, it's a good POV chapter. It's just kind of her kind of saying, okay, we're gonna go to the Kings Moot and going there. Not a deep chapter, not a lot going on. We get a little bit more of Asha in the next book. She has 3 POVs in the next book. So we'll talk a lot more about her in the next one, because we really don't get much here in this book. But yeah, really just a chapter to kind of tell us what's going on with Asha. Where is she? What's she gonna do? And she's gonna go to the Kings Moot, and kind of how poorly her situation is because of kind of how she's a woman in this society, and women really are not valued on that level as a king or kind of queen. And that's kind of the moral really for Asha in this book. And yeah, getting on to both Arya Hota and Eris Oakheart, they both get 1 chapter. They're kind of our eyes into Dorne, and they're kind of just observer type characters, where Arya Hota especially is a character where he's just kind of placed there to introduce us into Ariane Martell and the Dornish and what's going on, without having Ariane as a POV, because then it would really weaken a lot of the Dornish plot, because we'd already know what was going on. It would kill a lot of the kind of things going on that we kind of figure out later on in the book. But that's really what Arya Hota is. He's one of my least favorite POV characters, because he definitely just feels like someone in the background. He really doesn't have a personality really either. Now again, he is a good fighter. Well, we ain't gonna take that away from him. But again, not the most interesting POV. Eris Oakheart as well is kind of our last kind of named POV. We also are gonna get to Pate, which is another kind of big reveal. But Eris Oakheart, really, he's just a character that is used to introduce us into Ariane, and also to kind of show us how Ariane is able to kind of manipulate Eris. I know that Ariane did have some feelings for Eris Oakheart, but she was also manipulating him as well. Daenerys does the same thing with Cal in book 1 to kind of invade Westeros, so she's trying to do the same thing. We see a lot in this world that women really have their power by trying to influence their husbands once they're in a position of power to do things that they want. That's the way we see a lot of women are able to use their power. And that's just kind of highlighted in that main chapter with Eris Oakheart. And then Pate, he is kind of a novice at the Citadel in Old Town. A really interesting way to kind of introduce the book, because a lot of his book is, or a lot of his POV is kind of looking at the common folk. How do they feel about the war and how everything's going on, and the the rumors of the dragons, the rumors of how Tywin died. Something I think is really awesome is how we see how so many different people interpret Tywin's death. Like, there's so many different rumors, just how there would be in real life. And I think that's really great, amplified in this chapter. And hate, and again, the common theme is, if you're a POV character in the first chapter of a book, you're dead. So Pate ends up dying at the end of this book. He is killed by a Faceless Man. And we know the Faceless Man is using Pate's kind of face by the end of the book, with Samwell kind of being introduced to this Pate character. And I would just say Pate's a very strong kind of introduction into this character. It provides a little bit of foreshadowing for Arya, what Arya is trying to kind of be with the Faceless Men, and also kind of giving us this eerie feel in Old Town when Samwell does eventually actually get there, as to what is going on with what the whole Pate story was going on. Like, what was so important about this key and all that, and getting the book and all that stuff. What was that important that Pate needed to get that for the Faceless Men? And that's kind of all of our major POVs in this book. And just talking about this book, right? I think this book has a lot of work it has to do, along with Dance. But here's the thing with Dance, and why I think Dance gets a pass. Dance has more of our characters that are established, are, you know, bigger characters like Jon, Tyrion, Daenerys. They are all in the next book. We don't get any of them in this book, right? So we have a lot of characters that are very unknown. We have a lot of characters that we don't know much about them. So we're not as invested in those characters, and especially we're going to other places of Westeros we've really never been to. So this book has a lot of introducing of other places and a lot of other things going on, and setting up a lot of the scheming going on underneath the Lannister rule. The Dornish have their own stuff going. The Greyjoys are trying to kind of openly go against the Lannisters, more or less, by, again, invading the Reach. Also, they're looking to go to Old Town, trying to get a dragon with Daenerys and all that stuff. Again, we see that this book is plotting the seed that the Lannisters and the Tyrells are unfolding, and that a lot of these other factions are growing and looking to go against them. And we also have a lot of character building. So that is the main kind of premise of Feast. And because it doesn't have a lot of highs, and it doesn't have, I think, a lot of big payoffs, I think that is why this book is not as loved. And I think when you definitely compare it to the last one, it really takes a hit there. So that, to me, personally, is why I think a lot of people do not like Feast compared to the rest of the other books. Because even in Dance, you have a lot more payoffs. Jon dies at the end of Dance. Dany with the kind of the dragon coming back, her Drogon coming back, and all that stuff. Really big payoff. All of Theon's chapters are really great, and great payoffs to his character, in my opinion, especially the ones at the end. Davos is the North Remembers chapter with Wyman Manderley is a fantastic chapter. Quentin getting roasted. You just have so many great. You even have the payoffs of Cersei's character in this book as well. Like, Cersei has two more with the Walk of Atonement that she's going to get in that book. So that, to me, is kind of why Feast for Crows is a little bit on the worst side. Just because it doesn't have as many of the big payoffs, doesn't have the big characters that we love, and all that. So, to me, that's kind of why this book's here. It's the black sheep of the family, in my opinion, but it is a fantastic book still. I was someone that, after I read Storm of Swords, I did actually kind of dread reading A Feast for Crows, because I always have this stigma in my head when I don't touch the books for maybe a year or two, that I get to this book and I'm like, a lot of our major plots are going to go in a lot different routes and stuff. But I really did enjoy reading this book on my reread, and, I would encourage you to reread this book. I think it has a lot of great elements to it. I hope this video kind of talked about why this video does have a lot of good things going on, but what things really aren't as good in this book. If we're talking about, I think, plots like Sam, not the best in this book. Brienne can be on the weaker side in certain chapters and then be kind of really good chapters in other chapters. She's kind of all over the place, it feels like, in this book. But yeah, thank you guys all for watching this video. I hope you guys all enjoyed it, and I will see you guys in next week's video for A Dance with Dragons.
If If you think this has a happy ending, you haven't been paying attention.